There's a particular kind of silence that settles over the mountains just before something irreversible happens. Not the peaceful kind, not the hush of snowfall or the held breath before sunrise. The dangerous kind, the kind that carries weight. I've ridden these ridges long enough to know the difference. My name is Caleb Durst. I keep a logbook, have done since I was 19, when my father told me that a man who doesn't record what he sees is a man who hasn't truly lived it. Most of what I write is ordinary. Weather patterns, cattle movements, water sources, the occasional Apache trail I'm not supposed to notice but do. But every few years, I write something down that I know I'll still be reading on my deathbed, turning the pages with old fingers, wondering if it happened the way I remember or the way I needed it to. This is one of those entries. I met Elinor Voss in the autumn of 1889, when she was still Elinor Voss and not yet Elinor Whitmore, though she didn't know the Whitmore part yet. None of us did. Or rather, only one person did, and he'd spent the better part of a decade making sure the rest of the world stayed comfortably ignorant. His name was Thomas Whitmore. He went by Tom. He wore the same cracked leather boots for 3 years and mended his own shirts with brown thread because he claimed he couldn't afford the right color. He ate beans from a dented tin and never once complained about the cold. He was, by every visible measure, a poor mountain man, the kind who scraped by on odd work, who slept in bunkhouses more often than beds, who looked at you with those quiet gray eyes like he'd already made peace with having nothing. What I'm about to tell you isn't a love story exactly. Or maybe it's the most honest love story I've ever witnessed, and I've seen a few, good and bad and worse. It's about what happens when a man buries his whole life underground and hands someone a map without telling them what it leads to. It's about a woman who thought she'd chosen hardship because she loved the man inside it. And it's about what truth costs, not just to the person who finally speaks it, but to everyone standing close enough to feel the shockwave. Not metaphorically. Literally, boots planted in the creek mud, both hands wrapped around a lead rope, her jaw set with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has decided she will not lose this particular fight regardless of the cost. The mule, a gray-eared, thick-necked creature named Biscuit, as I'd later learn, had decided the crossing was beneath him and had communicated this view by sitting down in 8 inches of moving water. Elinor was not impressed by his opinion. "You are not a horse," she was telling him, in the firm, measured voice of someone trying very hard not to shout. "You are not allowed opinions about crossings. Get up." Biscuit did not get up. I pulled my mare to a stop on the bank, took out my logbook, reflex, I can't help it, and wrote, "Woman versus mule, creek crossing, Bitterroot Fork. She's going to win." Then I put the book away and called out, "You want a hand, ma'am?" She looked up, 40 feet of water between us, and I could still read the expression clearly. She wanted no such thing, but she was practical enough to accept what was offered. "If it's not an imposition," she said, clipping each word. It wasn't. I crossed, got behind Biscuit, made a particular sound low in my throat that I'd learned from an Apache horseman named Delche 3 years prior. Something between a click and a hum that animals respond to in ways I've never fully understood. And the mule stood, shook himself, and walked across the creek like the whole argument had been someone else's idea. Elinor watched him go. Then she looked at me with those sharp, estimating brown eyes and said, "What did you do?" "Nothing much," I said. "He just needed a different question." She considered that, didn't say it made sense, didn't say it didn't, just tucked the information somewhere behind her expression and moved on. That was Elinor Voss. That was the whole of her in that one moment, practical, stubborn, too proud for help but not too proud to accept it when it arrived. She had a quality I'd only ever seen in people who'd been through something, a kind of density, like she took up more space than her body suggested. Not arrogance, something older than arrogance. Survivorship, maybe. I found out later she'd come west from Pennsylvania 2 years prior, after her father's hardware business failed and her mother took sick, and her engagement to a respectable banker named Harlan Foss dissolved with the family's savings. She'd come west because there was nothing left to stay for, and because her cousin had a homestead claim in the Bitterroot Valley, and because Elinor Voss was not the kind of woman who waited for circumstances to improve. She made circumstances improve. By the time I met her, she'd been working her cousin's land for 18 months, genuinely working it, not assisting with it. She'd extended the irrigation channels herself, repaired the barn roof in the middle of a July thunderstorm, negotiated with 3 separate supply merchants in Hawkridge until she'd gotten the seed prices down to something that made sense. Her cousin, a decent but vague man named Arthur, had taken to deferring to her on most practical matters and calling her a leaner only when he was embarrassed about it. She was 27. She was not particularly at peace with the world, but she had achieved a workable arrangement with it. Tom Whitmore entered this arrangement approximately 3 weeks after I did. I should say something about Hawkridge, since it matters. Hawkridge was not a large town. 200 and perhaps 40 souls, depending on the season and how generously you counted the people in the outlying homesteads. It had a general store run by a woman named Peta Morales who knew everything about everyone and shared most of it without being asked. It had a farrier, a physician who was also the dentist and occasionally the barber, a saloon that doubled as a meeting hall, and a church that the Reverend took very seriously and most of his congregation took as a social obligation. It also had, in the autumn of 1889, an unusual number of Apache families camped in the draw east of town, families who'd been pushed off their traditional lands by a combination of government policy, drought, and the particular human talent for deciding that someone else's home belongs to you. The arrangement was tense. Not violent, not yet, but tense in the way of a rope pulled too many different directions at once. I was in Hawkridge because I was hired to survey the disputed grazing boundary between 2 ranches whose owners had been feuding since before the war. It was dull work with the occasional exciting moment, which is how I prefer my employment. Tom Whitmore was in Hawkridge because, as best anyone could tell, he had nowhere else particularly to be. He arrived on a Tuesday, riding a horse that had seen better decades, carrying a bedroll and a canvas sack, and not much else. He took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, paid a week in advance in coins he counted out carefully, and introduced himself as a man who was handy with carpentry and looking for work. This was not unusual. Men like that passed through Hawkridge regularly. What was unusual was what happened over the following days, or rather, what I noticed, which may or may not be the same thing. I kept my logbook. I write things down. I noticed. He was too quiet in a particular way. Not shy quiet, not sullen quiet. The quiet of a man who is listening very carefully and choosing not to demonstrate how much he understands. He'd sit at the saloon table with a half-finished beer and say almost nothing while other men talked, and when he did speak it was brief and accurate and left no room for further exploration. Not rude, precise. His hands, I kept looking at his hands and not being able to explain why they bothered me. They were working hands, calloused, scarred, permanently sun-darkened. But the scarring was wrong for carpentry. The particular thickness around the joints and the way he held tools were correct, but there was something else in those hands, some layer of competence that didn't match the story. I wrote Whitmore, something not adding up, can't place it, hands. Then I closed the book and told myself I was being suspicious of a man who had given me no reason for it, and went back to my survey work. The first time he met Eleanor was at Peta Morales's store, which I heard about in detail approximately 4 hours later, because Peta Morales is constitutionally incapable of letting information die in her possession. He held the door for her, Peta told me in the tone of someone delivering evidence. Not just held it, stepped back, made room, the full thing, like he'd been taught by someone who meant it. Then she thanked him, and he said it's no trouble in that quiet way he has, and she looked at him for about a second too long. That's not very much, I said. Caleb Durst, said Peta. I have watched approximately 400 courtships begin in this store over 31 years, and I know what a second too long looks like. I wrote in my logbook that evening, Peta thinks something is starting. Peta is usually right. I want to be careful here, because I was an observer of what followed, not a participant, and I don't want to impose a shape on things that had their own shape. What I can tell you is what I saw. Eleanor and Tom Whitmore began to exist in each other's orbit in the slow, deliberate way of people who are both suspicious of want. They did not rush. They were not particularly gentle with each other, either not in the early days. Eleanor was direct to the point of bluntness, and Tom matched her in a way that seemed to both surprise and settle her. She was accustomed to being too much, too capable, too direct, too practical for most men's comfort. Tom didn't appear to find her too much. He appeared to find her correctly sized. He helped her with a fencing repair one Saturday in early October, not because she asked, but because he was passing and could see she was struggling with the post driver, and he simply stopped and took it and worked alongside her without making it into anything. When they were done, she gave him coffee from a flask and they sat on the fence rail for a while, not talking very much, and I watched from a ridge I was working on 50 yards away and thought, there it is. He told her over the following weeks that he had been a carpenter's apprentice in his youth, had drifted through several territories doing various kinds of work, had no family living, no particular home, and modest savings. He didn't embellish. He didn't apologize for it. He laid it out the way you'd describe a piece of land. Here are the features, here are the limitations. Draw your own conclusions. Elena drew her conclusions. She told me about it one afternoon in November, when I'd stopped at the farm to ask Arthur about a property line, and ended up sitting in Elena's kitchen while she made biscuits with the efficiency of someone who doesn't believe in wasted motion. She said, "I know he doesn't have much." "Does that matter to you?" I asked, which was probably impertinent. She was quiet for a moment, the working kind of quiet, where her hands kept moving but something behind her face was doing something else. "I had much once," she said. "My father's house was full of much, and then it was empty, and I learned that the much had been scaffolding, I suppose, something we stood on rather than something we were." She shaped a biscuit. "I'm not afraid of less." I wrote that down that night almost verbatim because I thought it was important. I still think it is. What Elena meant, what she was saying between those careful, flour-dusted words, was that she had made a choice. Actively, consciously. She had seen Tom Whitmore with his worn boots and his counted coins and his one serviceable coat, and she had decided that what he was, the inside of him, the quality of him, was worth more than what he had. This was not self-deception. Elena Voss was incapable of self-deception. It was deliberate preference, arrived at through the kind of honest accounting that only people who have lost things can do. She chose him, not despite the poverty, because of what she could see underneath it. And he knew. That's the thing I've turned over in the years since, lying awake in various bunkhouses with my logbook on my chest. He knew what she was choosing, and he let her choose it. They married in January of 1890. Mrs. Calloway's parlor, 8 guests. Elena wore a dark blue wool dress she'd made herself, and Tom wore his one good shirt with the collar pressed flat, and the Reverend read the service in a voice that suggested he was doing them a favor, which perhaps he was. I stood near the window with my logbook in my coat pocket, not writing anything. There are moments when the act of observation becomes its own kind of intrusion, and this was one of them. I just watched. Elena's face during the ceremony was, I'm going to try to describe this accurately, because I think it matters. It was not radiantly joyful in the storybook sense. It was something more interior than that. She looked like a woman who has made a decision after a very long time of deliberating, and is now at peace with the decision, and also faintly terrified by that peace, because peace is unfamiliar and unfamiliar things require trust. She kept glancing at Tom sideways, small, quick glances, like she was checking that he was still there and still himself, and still meaning what he appeared to mean. Tom was looking at her with those gray eyes in a way I can only describe as careful. The way you look at something you know is fragile and precious, and that you are aware you could break. I wrote it down that night. I always do. But I put a mark in the margin next to that entry, a small star I use for things that feel important in ways I can't yet articulate. I wasn't sure what I was marking. I know now. The first year of their marriage, by all observable accounts, was real. That's the word I keep coming back to. Real. They took the small cabin on the east end of Arthur's property. Arthur had built it for himself, then found he preferred the main house, and Tom repaired it over the course of the winter with the focused, methodical attention of a man who has rebuilt things before and knows how they should stand. He reinforced the foundation. He replaced the flue. He rechinked the walls with a precision that, again, struck me as slightly in excess of what the situation required, but I kept that observation in my own head. Elena ran the household finances with the same grinding efficiency she applied to everything, and the picture was modest but workable. Tom took carpentry work where he could get it. She took in mending and helped Arthur with accounts. They grew a kitchen garden. They kept chickens. They were, in the economy of the valley, a poor couple doing what poor couples did, which was work and manage and make do. I visited occasionally. I was surveying other parcels in the broader region that year, so I passed through Hawkridge 4 or 5 times. Each time I had dinner at their table, I left with the same impression. This was a genuine thing, not performed, not managed. Tom Whitmore sat at that table in his mended shirt and ate Alina's cooking and talked about fence posts and spring planting with the absorption of a man who is entirely present in his life, who wants nothing outside the room he's in. Except I wrote in my logbook after the third such visit, there's a drawer in the desk in the corner that's always locked. Tom doesn't look at it. He's very deliberate about not looking at it. A man who is not hiding something does not practice not looking at things. I wrote hands still wrong. The quiet is a choice, not a nature. He is performing something, I just can't determine what. Then I told myself to stop being the kind of man who invents problems where none exist, and I went back to my survey work. The first crack appeared in February of 1891. A rider came through Hawkridge heading north, a man named Pemberton who worked for a land office out of Butte. I knew him slightly, in the way you know men who occupy the same professional margins. He was staying at Mrs. Calloway's, and we shared a table one evening, and in the course of conversation he mentioned he'd heard of the valley, had in fact been looking at some documents related to land holdings in the region. Big consolidation happened about 8 years ago, he said, cutting his meat. Most of the northern ridge parcels all the way from the Bitterroot Fork to the Canyon Springs tributary. Somebody bought it all up, quiet-like, not through any local broker, went through a holding company in Boston. He paused. Nobody seems to know who the final owner is. The company's a shell or something close to it. I said nothing. I looked at my food. Odd thing, he continued, is that the land hasn't been developed, just held. Property taxes paid on time, every year no action, like somebody's waiting for something. I didn't write anything in my logbook that evening. Instead, I sat with it, the discomfort of a piece of information that doesn't quite fit the puzzle you've been assembling. That makes you look back at all your previous pieces and wonder if you'd been holding the picture upside down. The northern ridge parcels. Tom Whitmore's cabin sat on the eastern edge of those parcels. I told myself it was coincidence. The West is full of land speculation. Mysterious Boston holding companies are practically a regional tradition. I told myself that the locked drawer and the wrong hands and the particular quality of Tom's silence were the ordinary mysteries of a private man, not the symptoms of something larger. I told myself this for approximately 3 more months. Then Alina came to find me. She arrived at my camp on a Wednesday morning in May, which told me it was serious. Alina did not ride 4 miles on a workday for social purposes. She looked tired in the way of someone who has not been sleeping, and there was something around her eyes that I recognized as controlled distress, the kind where the control costs more than the distress. She sat down on a log by my fire and accepted coffee and held the cup in both hands and said, without preamble, "Tell me what you know about my husband." I said carefully, "I know what you know." "Don't," she said, not sharp, just clean, the word of someone who can't afford to waste time on evasion. "You keep that logbook, you write things down. You've been watching us since before we were an us, and I've always known it, and I've never minded because you're not malicious and because sometimes it's useful to be seen by someone who notices things." She looked at me directly. "So tell me, what have you noticed that I should know?" I was quiet for a moment, the fire between us, the early morning smell of pine and water. "Why now?" I asked. She set her cup down. "Because 3 days ago a man came to our door. He didn't ask for Tom. He asked for a Mr. Thomas Whitmore and used a particular phrasing. He said he had correspondence from a Mr. Aldridge in connection with the Whitmore holdings." She paused. "Tom sent him away, very calmly, very quickly. Then he came inside and sat at the table and didn't say anything for a long time, and when I asked him about it, he said it was a mistake, wrong man, that he'd told the man as much." "Did you believe him?" I asked. Alina looked at the fire. Something moved across her face, something old and well-exercised, the muscle of a woman who has been disappointed before and knows the particular weight of realizing that a thing she trusted was not what it appeared to be. "I believed," she said slowly, "that he believed I believed him." Which was not the same thing at all. I picked up my logbook. I found the entry from February, the one about Pemberton and the Northern Ridge parcels and the Boston Holding Company. I read it to her. When I finished, the silence between us had a different texture than the silence before. She didn't cry. Alina Whitmore, did not cry at this kind of thing. What she did was press her lips together very briefly, and then she nodded once, the nod of a person cataloging a new piece of information into an existing framework, and then she said, "Tell me the rest of what you noticed." So I told her, the hands, the drawer, the particular quality of his silence. The way he sometimes paused, almost imperceptibly, before answering questions about his past. A pause so small and so practiced that you'd miss it if you weren't in the habit of noticing small, practiced things. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was done, she stood up and brushed her skirt and picked up the reins of her horse and said, very quietly, "Thank you, Caleb." "Eleanor," I said, because I felt I had to. "Whatever it turns out to be, whatever this is, I don't think he meant you harm." She looked at me, those brown eyes level and exhausted. "No," she said, "I don't think so either. I think he meant me something much more complicated than harm." She mounted her horse. "That's almost worse." She rode back toward Hawkridge, and I stood by my fire with my logbook open to a blank page, and I wrote, "She knows. Whatever happens next, she knows." I want to stop here, before the knowing changes everything, and tell you something about Eleanor Whitmore that is not in my logbook, because I didn't know how to write it down in a way that didn't diminish it. She had been happy. In that first year of that modest, hand-to-mouth, bean-and-bread marriage, she had been genuinely, quietly, specifically happy. Not the happiness of ease, she'd had nothing close to ease. She'd worked harder in that cabin than she'd worked in any previous season of her life. Her hands were rougher. Her mornings were earlier. There were weeks when the money was thin enough that dinner was a decision rather than a meal. And she had been happy because she had believed, and she had been right to believe because she was an accurate observer and not a fool, that the man she had married was a man who saw her. Not the version of her that polite society wanted, not the capable but too much woman who unsettled men with her practicality, not the failing merchant's daughter or the broken engagement or any of the accumulated definitions that had been applied to her. Just her, Eleanor. The person who argued with mules and made biscuits without wasting motion and chose hard things on purpose because she trusted her own judgment about what was worth it. She had chosen him, and she had been glad of the choosing. And now she had to go home and reckon with the possibility that the man she'd chosen had not been entirely what he'd allowed her to choose. That is the part that I've never been able to write well, because it requires a kind of emotional precision that I don't entirely possess. What she was writing home to was not the simple grief of betrayal. It was something stranger. Something that required her to hold two true things simultaneously, that she had been deceived, and that the deception had inexplicably been one of the most real things anyone had ever done for her. I knew Tom Whitmore was going to have to explain himself. I did not envy him the task. That evening, I rode back toward Hawkridge on a route that took me past the eastern edge of the property. I wasn't going to their cabin. I told myself I was just passing. The light was going gold over the ridge, and the air had that spring quality of things deciding to become themselves. And from a distance I could see two figures outside the cabin, Tom on the steps, and Eleanor standing a few feet away. The particular distance of people who love each other and are also in the early stage of a hard conversation. I didn't stop. I didn't write anything down that night. Some things are not for logbooks. But as I passed, just within earshot for a moment before the wind took the sound, I heard Eleanor's voice, low, controlled, unbending as iron. She said, "Tell me who you are." And then the wind shifted, and I was past the tree line, and the rest was theirs. I rode on in the dark, holding the question in my chest like a coal. "Tell me who you are." I didn't sleep well the night after I passed their cabin. This is not unusual for me. I'm a light and suspicious sleeper by occupational necessity, and the high country has its own sounds that take years to learn as harmless. But this was a different kind of wakefulness. The logbook kind. I kept reaching for it in the dark and then putting it back without writing anything, because I hadn't found the words yet, and writing half-formed things only makes them harder to finish. What I kept coming back to was Eleanor's face that morning at my camp. The way she'd held her coffee in both hands like it was the only stable thing in the immediate vicinity. I've known men who hide things. I've known a fair number in my line of work, and the people left in the wake of that hiding have a particular look when the hiding becomes apparent. A look of recalibration, of quietly going back through everything and seeing it differently. Eleanor was doing that recalibration in real time, with a posture so controlled, it looked almost like ordinary stillness. Almost. I stayed in Hawkridge for the following 2 weeks, which I justified to myself as necessary for the survey work, though I had essentially completed that survey in April and was, if I'm honest, spinning it out. Peta Morales noticed. She notices everything, but was, for once, discreet about it, which told me she'd noticed something at the Whitmore cabin too, and was sitting with it the same way I was. On the fourth day, Tom came to find me. I was working on maps in a corner of the saloon. The afternoon light came through the west window at an angle useful for detail work, when he set a cup of coffee on my table, pulled out the opposite chair, and sat down. I said nothing. I closed my map case. I waited. He looked at the table for a moment. His hands were flat on the surface, those wrong-for-carpentry hands, and there was something in his posture that was different from the Tom Whitmore I'd observed for 18 months. Not bigger, exactly. More present, less carefully composed. "Eleanor tells me you keep a logbook," he said. "I do," I said. "And that you've had some observations about me." "I have," I said. He nodded as if confirming something he'd already suspected. Then he looked up at me, and I saw in his gray eyes something I hadn't seen there before. Not the careful blankness of performance, but something rower than that. Something that had been put away for a long time and was now finding itself back in the room. "I need to tell someone," he said, "who isn't Eleanor, not yet, before I can tell her properly. I need to say it to someone first and see if it survives the saying." I picked up my pen, old reflex. He watched me do it, then he said, "Will you write it down?" "That's what I do," I said. He was quiet for a moment. The saloon around us was nearly empty. It was mid-afternoon, that slack space between the lunch crowd and the evening drinkers. The barkeeper was polishing glasses at the far end and paying us no attention. Then Tom Whitmore said, "My name is Thomas Aldridge Whitmore. I'm the sole heir of the Whitmore Land Holdings in Northern Ridge, Bitterroot Sector, 3,800 acres, plus the mineral rights for 2 of those parcels. I have a residence in Boston that I have not entered in 9 years. I have accounts that I have not touched in the same period. I have a law office in that city that manages my affairs through a holding company. And I have, for the duration of those 9 years, been deliberately and systematically living as though none of it exists." I wrote all of it down. My pen didn't stop. My face didn't change. I've had practice at that. When I finished, I said, "Why?" He looked at his hands. "Because I didn't want it," he said. "Any of it. My father built it, my grandfather before him, and they were the kind of men who build things like that are a particular kind of men, and I am not that kind, and I knew from the time I was 17 that what they were building was going to land on me like a weight I had no interest in carrying." He paused. "I tried for a while, ran the estate properly, sat in the meetings. Wore the suits. I was very unhappy, not in a dramatic way, in the specific grinding way of a man who is not himself." "So you left," I said. "I left," he said. "I walked away from it. I arranged for the holding company to continue managing and paying taxes. I'm not irresponsible, whatever else I am, and I came west, and I started over as nothing." "And you've been nothing ever since," I said. The edge in my voice was slight, but he heard it. "Not nothing," he said quietly, "just less, deliberately less, because I wanted to find out what I was when no one was counting anything." I sat back. Outside the window, a pair of horses were tied at the post, swishing flies in the afternoon heat. Somewhere up the street, someone was hammering something. "You let Eleanor choose you," I said, without telling her the whole of what she was choosing. He closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." "She chose you as a poor man," I said. "She made peace with that choice. I've seen her make that peace, Whitmore, or whatever your name is. She decided that the less was worth it. She built a life around the less." "I know," he said. "And now you're about to tell her that there was no less, that the less was a performance she wasn't informed she was watching." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Is that how you see it?" "I see a woman," I said carefully, "who told me that she'd had much once and learned it was scaffolding, who explicitly, deliberately, chose to love a man without much because she decided much wasn't the point. And I think when you tell her the truth, the thing that's going to hurt her most isn't that you were rich. It's that her choice, the thing she was most proud of choosing, turns out to have been made with incomplete information." I put down my pen. "She chose bravely. She'd like to have done that knowing what she was really choosing." Tom stared at the table. "She's going to be furious," I said. "I know," he said. "And then what?" I said. He looked up, and I saw something in his face, not calculated, not performed, just the plain, exposed architecture of a man who has finally stopped managing the distance between himself and a feeling. "I don't know," he said. "I genuinely don't know. I'm aware that is not a sufficient answer. I am also aware that I have been living for 9 years in certainty, certain that I had made the right choice, certain that the life I was building was real, certain that the man I was becoming was better than the man I would have been, and now I am completely uncertain about all of it. And it's a particular feeling." "What feeling?" I asked. "Like standing on a floor that's suddenly not sure it's a floor," he said. I wrote that down. It felt important. He told me the rest of it over the following hour, and I recorded it as best I could. His father had died when Tom was 26. This was 11 years ago now, in 1880. The estate had passed to him cleanly, no contested will, no complications. He had managed it for 2 years in Boston, genuinely trying. He'd been engaged during that period to a woman from a similarly wealthy family, a suitable match by every external measure, which is exactly why it had felt so thoroughly wrong. He'd ended the engagement, which had caused a significant social rupture. He'd sold the Boston house, put everything into the holding company's management, and headed west. "Did you tell anyone?" I asked. "My lawyer," he said, "and my mother's sister, who thought I had gone temporarily mad but was kind enough to keep it to herself." "No one else." "No one else," he said. "That was the point. The point was to disappear from the Thomas Whitmore who owned things and find out if there was a Thomas Whitmore underneath who was worth anything without them." "And what did you find?" I asked. He almost smiled. "Not quite. A man who is reasonably good with his hands and very bad at talking about himself," he said. "A man who is happier in a cold cabin than in a warm office. A man who—" He stopped, looked at the window. "A man who looked at a woman arguing with a mule in a creek and thought, quite clearly, that is the most genuine person I have ever seen, and wanted badly to be near that genuineness." I let that sit for a moment. "She's going to ask why you didn't tell her," I said. "I know. What will you say?" He was quiet. "That I was afraid," he said finally. "That the first time I met her, she looked at me like I was a man and not a portfolio, and I had not been looked at that way in so long that I didn't want to ruin it. And then I told myself I would tell her soon, after she knew me well enough to judge me apart from it. And then it was never the right time, and then we were married, and then it was, the longer it went, the more impossible it became." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "Which I understand is not a defense. I'm not offering it as a defense." "What are you offering it as?" I asked. "An explanation," he said, "from a man who knows the difference." I wrote that down too. He went home that afternoon to tell her. I know this because I saw him go, and I know what the telling cost because I could see the cabin's lit window from my camp that night, the lamp burning later than it should, and in the morning when I passed at a careful distance, there was no smoke from the chimney, which meant no fire had been lit for breakfast, which meant the occupants of the cabin had either left very early or not slept at all. Peta Morales found me at noon. "Eleanor was in the store this morning before 6, she said, setting down a plate she hadn't asked me if I wanted. "Bought flour and salt and coffee and didn't say a word beyond what she needed to. Her eyes were red." Peta sat across from me. "And Tom came in afterward for rope and axe oil and also said nothing. And he looked like a man who has recently walked through fire and is still checking himself for burns." "Thank you, Peta," I said. She looked at me sharply. "You know what this is about." "Some of it," I said. "Is she going to be all right?" I thought of Eleanor in my camp with her coffee cup, the controlled distress around her eyes, the iron steadiness of her voice when she asked what I had noticed. I thought of the woman who had chosen less on purpose and been glad of the choosing. "Yes," I said, "eventually." Peta nodded. She picked up her plate and went back behind her counter, and I ate my food and looked at my logbook and thought about the question Eleanor had asked Tom on the cabin steps. "Tell me who you are." He had finally answered it. The answer was enormous, and it was going to take time to find a place to put. For the first week after the telling, Eleanor and Tom Whitmore maintained their ordinary routines with a precision that struck me as the behavioral equivalent of walking very carefully across ice you're not sure will hold. She ran the household. He did his work. They occupied the same cabin, ate at the same table, slept, I assume, in the same bed. They were not performing normalcy for the town. Hawkridge was small enough that people would have noticed disruption, and there was none. But I could see, when I happened to cross either of them, that the normalcy was costing something. Alina was doing the thing she did with hard information, sitting with it, turning it over, not reacting until she understood what she was reacting to. Tom was doing something I can only describe as waiting. Not passive waiting, not abdication. The waiting of a man who has said everything he can say and is now correctly leaving room for the other person to exist in the aftermath without interference. I didn't approach either of them. I worked my survey. I kept writing. I wrote things down that I wasn't sure were right because writing helps me think even when the thoughts aren't finished. What I kept coming back to was the central strangeness of the situation. Tom Whitmore had lied to Alina, yes, by omission, systematically, over the span of a courtship and a marriage. This was undeniable and considerable. But the lie had been, it was not the usual kind of lie. It was not the lie of a man who wanted to use her or deceive her for gain or appear to be something he wasn't in order to take what he couldn't otherwise have. It was, if I was understanding it correctly, the lie of a man who wanted to be genuinely known before his circumstances obscured him. A man who was afraid that if he came into Alina's life with 3,800 acres of northern ridge behind him, she would see the acres and not the man. I wrote, he withheld himself in order to be himself. I cannot decide if this is the most loving thing I've ever heard of or the most selfish. Then I wrote maybe both, maybe the same thing. The second week, Alina came to my camp again. This time she didn't look tired. She looked like a woman who has done a significant amount of internal work and arrived at something not quite resolution but in the approximate neighborhood. She sat down by the fire. I had one going even in the warm weather, old habit, and this time she didn't want coffee. I need to think out loud, she said, to someone who already knows. Go ahead, I said. I'm angry, she said, in the tone of someone reporting a weather condition. I want that stated clearly. I am genuinely angry, and I think I'm entitled to the anger, and I'm not going to abbreviate it or apologize for it. No one's asking you to, I said. Good, she looked at the fire. And I also, she stopped, pressed her lips together. I find that the anger and the other thing are not as incompatible as I would have expected. What's the other thing? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, not evasive, thinking. Alina thought before she spoke. It was one of the things I'd always respected about her. He told me, she said finally, that the first time he saw me arguing with that mule, he thought that I was the most genuine person he had seen in a very long time. That he had spent years in rooms full of people performing versions of themselves for each other, and that I looked entirely incapable of performance. And that he wanted, she paused. He wanted to be near something genuine because he had forgotten what it felt like. I said nothing. I want to be angry at that, she said. I've been trying to be angry at that specifically, but I find I can't quite, because she turned her hands over in her lap looking at them. Because that is exactly what I thought about him, that he was genuine, that underneath the worn boots and the mended shirts and the nothing he had, there was a man being entirely himself without artifice. She looked up at me. I was right. That's the part I keep arriving at. I wasn't wrong about him. The man I married, the man I thought he was, that man is real. Tom Whitmore, who argues with me about fence lines and mends things with wrong-colored thread and goes quiet when something matters, that's real. Yes, I said, I believe it is. He just also owns a great deal of land, she said, and there was something in her voice then, dry, almost reluctant, that was close to humor. Not forgiving humor. Just the humor of a situation that is so specifically strange that it passes through absurdity on its way to something else. He does, I said. Which I didn't know, she said. No, I said. Which I should have been told, she said, and the dryness was gone and the anger was back, clean and warranted. Not because it would have changed my choice. I don't think it would have changed my choice, but because it was my choice to make with full information, and I deserved that. I deserved to choose the real version, not the curated one. Yes, I said, you did. She was quiet, the fire between us. Somewhere on the ridge, a bird was making its evening argument with the dark. What do I do now? She said, and the question was smaller and more genuine than anything else she'd said, the question underneath the anger, the one that didn't have an obvious answer. I don't know, I said. That's the honest answer. I know you don't know, she said, not unkindly. I wasn't asking you to, I was just saying it. I understood. I picked up my pen but didn't write anything. Sometimes the pen is just something to hold. What happened in the following weeks was not dramatic. That surprised me because I think I expected drama, confrontation, revelation, the grand architectural reckoning of a marriage on the edge of something. What happened instead was slower and stranger and more interesting than drama. They started talking. Not about the land, not at first. About other things. About the 9 years of his walking away and what he'd found in them and what he'd lost. About her father's hardware store and the smell of metal polish and the specific humiliation of a family that had always been comfortable discovering that comfort is not structural. About what they had each been before the West and what they'd been trying to become and whether those things were compatible. I know some of this from Peta, who knows some of this from the way people carry themselves in a small town. And I know some from Tom himself, who came to sit with me a second time one afternoon and talked with the quiet absorption of a man clearing an interior space that has been cluttered for a long time. She asked me, he said, what I wanted to do about the land. What did you say? I asked. I said I didn't want to go back to Boston, he said. I said I had no interest in being that man again, but I also told her, he paused. I told her that the land exists and pretending it doesn't is its own dishonesty, and that whatever we decide, we should decide together. That she's entitled to a vote in the version of our life we're living. How did she respond? He almost smiled again. This time it reached a little further. She said that she'd been making decisions about her own life for long enough without someone offering her a vote, and she was not going to squander the opportunity. That sounds like her, I said. It does, he said, and something in his voice when he said it, something soft and private, told me that the thing between them was not as broken as I had feared. Not healed, not resolved, but not broken. The decision, when it came from Alina. She had, as was her nature, thought it through carefully and arrived at a position before she announced it. She presented it to Tom on an evening in early July, and she told me about it the next morning in the matter-of-fact manner of someone reporting a solved problem. I'm not going to Boston, she said, and he's not going back to being a man with nothing because that was always somewhat fictional and I'd rather deal with the reality I'm actually in. But we're also not going to become whatever that life would have been. The estate dinners and the accounts and the performance of accumulated wealth. What then? I asked. The land is here, she said, 3,800 acres of northern ridge, some of it grazing, some of it timber, some of it I don't know yet. She looked out toward the ridge, visible in the morning light. I'd like to know it. I'd like to know what's there and what it's worth, and what could be done with it that's actually worth doing. She paused. There are Apache families in the draw east of town who have been using parts of that ridge as seasonal grazing since before any of us were born. The fact that Thomas Aldridge Whitmore owns a piece of paper that says he owns the land they've been using doesn't change the fact that they've been using it. I looked at her. That's a complicated position, I said carefully. Yes, she said, it is, I'm aware. What are you proposing to do with it? Talk to them, she said simply, before we decide anything, before any of it moves forward. I wrote that down. Then I put down my pen and looked at her, Alina Whitmore, who had come west with nothing and chosen a man she thought had nothing, and was now sitting on 3,800 acres of complicated landscape with an expression of absolute practical intention. Peta's going to be amazed, I said. The first meeting between Alina Whitmore and the Apache families in the draw happened on a Wednesday in mid-July. I was there, not as a participant, I want to be clear about that. I was there because Alina had asked me to come, and because she said she wanted someone who was good at noticing things and keeping quiet, and because she trusted me to write accurately rather than conveniently. Those were her exact words. I need someone who will write what happened, not what it was comfortable for it to have happened. I said I would do my best. It was a clear morning, hot already at 8 o'clock, the kind of heat that settles into stone and stays. We rode out to the draw in a group of 4, Alina and Tom, a woman named Beatrice Horn who had been working with the Apache families as something between a translator and an advocate for the better part of 2 years, and me. The encampment was larger than I'd realized from the ridge, 40, perhaps 50 people, across several family groups. The central fire had been put out for the day's heat, but the ring of it was still dark in the earth. Children stopped what they were doing to watch us approach. Adults moved with the measured economy of people who have had many encounters with white visitors and have learned to make no assumptions about the nature of any particular one. Beatrice led us to the man I understood to be the primary spokesperson for the gathered families, a man named Nazi, which Beatrice told us meant something approximately equivalent to one who leads at the edge. He was perhaps 60, gray-haired, with a face that had been weathered into a topography of specific experience. He sat on a low, flat rock and watched us arrive without expression. Tom was quiet, the real quiet, the one I'd always thought was wrong for carpentry. In this context, it read differently. In this context, it read as the quiet of a man who understands he is not the important person in this situation and is behaving accordingly. Elinor stepped forward. She introduced herself, and Beatrice translated, and she said, "My husband has recently learned that he holds a document of ownership for a portion of the ridge land that your families have used seasonally. I want to understand the nature of that use and its history before any decisions are made about the land's future." Beatrice translated. Nazi listened. A long moment of the particular silence that is not absence but consideration. Then Nazi spoke. Beatrice translated. He said that the land had been seasonal grazing for 4 generations, that his grandfather had brought sheep to the upper ridge when the lower valleys were dry, and that this had continued until the land was fenced, and the families were told, approximately 12 years ago, that the upper grazing was no longer available. "Who told them?" Elinor asked. A pause. Beatrice. "A man from the east, he says, with papers." Tom quietly. "My father's agent, around 1879. Elinor looked at Tom briefly. Then she looked back at Nazi. She said, "What would returning the seasonal grazing access require from your perspective?" This question, the way she framed it from your perspective, produced something I noticed even across the translation. A shift in the room. Not dramatic, subtle. The difference between a conversation being conducted at you and a conversation being conducted with you. Nazi spoke at some length. Beatrice translated. He said the families needed nothing dramatic. They needed passage rights along the Eastern Trail, seasonal use of the upper ridge from June to September, access to the spring on the north slope during dry years. They had no expectation of ownership. They had never required that concept to exist, he said, which Beatrice translated with an expression that suggested the nuance was difficult. They had required the use, which was a different thing. "Yes," said Elinor when she heard this. "I understand the difference." She looked at Tom. Tom looked at her. Something passed between them. Some silent consultation of the kind that only works when 2 people know each other deeply enough to conduct an argument in a glance. Then Tom said quietly, "We can do that. The passage rights, the seasonal use, the spring access. We can put it in writing and file it properly." Beatrice translated. Nazi was quiet for a moment. Then he said something short, and Beatrice translated it with a slight smile. He said he appreciated the written document, since documents seemed to be how white people remembered things. "I wrote that down. I will always have that in my logbook." The weeks that followed were complicated in the specific way that doing a right thing is always complicated. Not simple or clean or free of friction, but complicated in a way that felt meaningful rather than arbitrary. Tom began the process of engaging his lawyers in Boston to formalize the usage rights for the Apache families, which required explaining to men who had been managing his affairs at a comfortable distance for 9 years that their client had not only reemerged from his deliberate absence, but had arrived with opinions about what his property was for. The correspondence that arrived in return was extensive and occasionally alarmed. Elinor read all of it, which Tom had not suggested but which she'd stated flatly was how this was going to work, and he'd agreed without hesitation. She also began, during this period, the thing that I can only describe as taking inventory of the ridge. Not in a commercial sense, not initially. She simply wrote it. Every few days, alone or with Tom or occasionally with Beatrice, she rode some portion of those 3,800 acres and looked at what was there. What she found she wrote in a ledger, not my kind of logbook, Elinor's kind, which was practical and measured and organized by section rather than by feeling. I asked her, one afternoon when I'd joined her on one of these rides, what she was looking for. "I want to understand what I'm responsible for before I decide what to do with it," she said. "That's not how most people approach property," I said. No, she said, it isn't. We were at the top of the north slope. The view from there is considerable. The valley below, Hawkridge visible as a smudge of smoke and roofline. The Bitterroot Fork catching the afternoon light, and beyond it more ridgeline, more country, more of the particular western infinity that gets into people's chests and doesn't come out. Tom was 20 yards away, crouched by the spring Nazi had mentioned, looking at something I couldn't see from where I was. He had, over the preceding weeks, been doing a version of the same thing Alina was doing, moving through the land with the attention of a man relearning something he'd stepped away from. Not relearning stewardship in the way he'd rejected it in Boston, but learning it differently. Learning it from the ground up, literally. Learning it through the specific weight of stone and the direction of water and the evidence of who and what had been there before. He's changed, I said, not quite meaning to say it aloud. He's becoming something, Alina said, not looking at me. What he was going to become if he'd stayed in Boston, I can see the shape of that man, and he's not it. He walked away from it deliberately, and he found something else, and what he's finding now is, she paused. A third thing, the accumulated version. Is that what you want? I said, the accumulated version. She thought about it. The wind came up the slope and caught her hair, and she put a hand up to hold it back, an unself-conscious gesture, entirely practical. I married him, she said, not the Boston version and not the deliberate poverty version, but him, whoever that is in the aggregate. She looked across at Tom by the spring. I'm still angry. I want that noted. Noted, I said. But the anger is, it's become a specific anger, rather than a general one, she said. I'm angry that he didn't trust me with the truth early enough. I'm not angry about the choice he made to leave it because I understand that choice. I'm angry about being kept out of the information when keeping me in would not have changed anything, except that I would have known. Have you told him that? I asked. At length, she said, with the faint dryness that was becoming more present in her speech as the weeks passed, as if some internal pressure had found a small release valve. He listened. He didn't defend himself. He said. She stopped. What? She was quiet for a moment. He said that the hardest thing he'd ever done was tell me the truth, because the telling meant he had to watch me re-examine a year and a half of our life for falseness, and he knew he'd put that weight on me, and he couldn't take it back. She looked at the valley. He said he would spend however long it took making enough real things happen, that the false version got crowded out. I wrote that down. And do you believe him? I asked. She looked at me with those brown eyes, and there was something in them that was not quite the controlled distress of that morning at my camp, and not yet the peace that I hoped was ahead of her, but something between the honest face of a woman mid-crossing, who has looked at the far bank and decided it's worth the water. I'm finding out, she said. In August, Tom made a decision that I don't think Alina expected. He rode to the draw alone one morning, not with Beatrice, not with Alina, not with me. He went and sat with Nazi and the elders for the better part of a day, and what passed between them I know only second-hand from Beatrice, who heard it from one of the younger men in the camp who spoke some English. Apparently Tom told them, through a combination of Beatrice's later help and a great deal of slow, gestural communication, something about himself, about where he'd come from and what he'd walked away from, and why he'd ended up on this particular ridge in this particular valley. He didn't tell it as a confession, according to Beatrice's source. He told it as, and here Beatrice used a phrase that struck me as one version of a person being lost and found. Nazi, it was reported, had listened to all of it and then said something that Beatrice translated later as roughly. A man who has walked away from a wrong life and is not sure yet where the right one is, that is a man we understand. I wrote it down. I write everything down. But there was something else that came out of that meeting, something more practical. Tom had proposed, carefully, not as an edict but as a question, whether any of the younger men in the camp would be willing to work the ridge with him over the coming months, learning its water patterns and soil and the locations of things that might be useful or valuable. Not as labor he was employing, but as expertise he was seeking. People who had been reading that land for 4 generations would know things about it that he couldn't discover in a year. The answer, after a great deal of deliberation that Tom had apparently sat through with remarkable patience, was a tentative yes. Alina, when she heard this, was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He came up with that himself." "Apparently," I said. She nodded slowly, the cataloging nod. "Good," she said, and the word was less the praise of a superior and more the recognition of a person seeing something line up correctly. The autumn changed things the way autumn does in the mountain country, decisively, without apology. September arrived like a door closing, the light going gold and slant, the nights dropping fast and serious. I was finishing my survey work in the region and knew that my time in Hawkridge was coming to an end. I'd been there longer than I'd originally planned. The Whitmore business had, among other things, given me professionally useful reasons to stay, but it was time. I had work in other territories. My logbook was nearly full. I had dinner with Tom and Alina at the cabin on a Thursday evening in late September, and it was the most ordinary dinner I'd had there in months. Not performed normalcy, actually ordinary. Alina's food was good, Tom's company was engaged and specific, and the cabin had a quality that I associate with places where people are genuinely living rather than managing the appearance of it. The lamp was low. Something was dried on the wall by the window, sage, I think. The dented tin Tom used to cook his beans in was still on the shelf, though I noticed he was eating from a proper dish. He caught me looking at the tin. He said, "I can't quite bring myself to throw it out." "Don't," I said. He nodded, understanding what I meant, or what I hoped I meant. After dinner, Alina brought out a bottle of something that was not quite whiskey, but close enough for the purpose, and we sat by the window in the declining autumn light and drank small amounts of it, and were quiet together in the way of people who have shared a significant chunk of time and don't need to fill it all with words. Tom said after a while, "You're leaving soon." "Next week," I said. He nodded. "Then I'm aware that you've been something more than an observer this year, whatever you want to call it." "Witness, maybe," I said. "Witness," he agreed. "I'm grateful for it." I said, "I hope it goes well, what you're building here." He looked at Alina, who was looking out the window at the darkening ridge, her glass balanced on her knee, some private accounting happening behind her eyes. He looked at her in that careful way he had, the way of a man watching something he knows is precious, and that he was aware he had nearly broken through his own failures of courage. "It's not going to be simple," he said. "No," I said. "The land is complicated. The history of the land is complicated. What we owe, what can even be owed in a situation like this, that's going to be a question we're still answering in 10 years. "Probably," I said. "And Alina is," he stopped, reconsidered. "Alina doesn't do forgiveness quickly, or rather she's not withholding it. She's distributing it proportionally as it's earned, which is, I think, the right way, the honest way." "She's the most honest person I know," I said. "Yes," he said. "That's why he didn't finish it, didn't need to. I want to write something here about what I understood in that final week in Hawkridge, about what had actually happened between Tom Whitmore and Alina Voss. Because I've been recording the facts of it, and the facts are important, but there's something underneath the facts that I kept reaching for in my logbook and not quite catching. Let me try once more. Tom Whitmore spent 9 years being nobody in order to find out who he was. He did this honestly, inside his own private reckoning, and he found something real in the process, a self he could actually inhabit. The failure, the moral failure, was that when Alina arrived, and he saw in her someone who could genuinely know that self, he withheld the surrounding context. He gave her the man without the map. Alina Whitmore, knowing something was wrong, sitting with it, riding 4 miles in the morning to hear it said clearly, chose to engage with the full picture when it came. Not without anger, not without cost, but with the specific moral courage of a woman who has decided that reality, however complicated, is preferable to a comfortable arrangement with a partial truth. What they had built between them, the cabin, the table, the beans, and the bread, and the wrong-colored thread, was real. I'm certain of that. I've seen enough of the opposite to know the difference. What they were building now was the same thing, but with the full weight of it in the frame. And the full weight was considerable. 3,800 acres of contested history, a law office in Boston, Apache families who had been using land for generations that a piece of paper said belonged to someone else. A marriage that had been built on partial information and was now being rebuilt, painstakingly, honestly, with both parties showing up for the construction. It was not a happy ending in the easy sense. It was something more durable than that. On my last morning in Hawkridge, I rose early and saddled my mare and put my nearly full logbook in my saddlebag and started for the trail north. I told myself I wouldn't ride past the cabin, because it wasn't on my route, and because some endings are better made cleanly. I rode past the cabin. They were both outside in the early light, Alina in her working dress with her hair not yet pinned, Tom in his cracked leather boots, the two of them standing at the east-facing edge of the property and looking up at the ridge. The sun was coming up behind it, and the ridge was dark against the brightening sky, and they were standing close enough that their shoulders almost touched, not looking at each other, just looking at the land. I slowed my mare but didn't stop. I saw Tom say something, 2 or 3 words I couldn't hear. Alina turned her head to look at him and said something back, and whatever it was made him tilt his head in a way I associated with being caught slightly off guard in a good way. Then she turned back to the ridge, and so did he, and they stood there in the morning light looking at 3,800 complicated acres of mountain country, and whatever future was assembled in it, and I rode on. I've written this entry over several weeks, in various camps and bunkhouses along the northern survey route, returning to it when other work was done. I am aware that I have made some choices about what to emphasize and what to leave in the margins, as every observer does. What I want to say at the close of it is this. I have watched a fair number of people over the course of my working life, and I have written a fair number of them down. The ones who stay in the logbook longest, the ones I return to, who don't resolve cleanly into the simple versions of themselves, are the ones who are trying to be better than the thing that happened to them. Or in some cases, trying to be better than the thing they did. Tom Whitmore buried his whole life and handed someone a map without telling her where it led. That was a failure. He'll carry it the way you carry failures that cost other people, not forever in front of him, but always somewhere accessible. Alina Whitmore chose a man she thought had nothing, and discovered that nothing had been partially a choice, and had to decide whether the choosing still meant what she'd meant it to mean. She decided it did. Not because she let him off the hook, she didn't, but because she was honest enough to acknowledge that the man she'd chosen was real, even when the circumstances he'd described weren't complete. She'd been right about what mattered. She'd just been right without knowing the full picture, and she was going to spend the next considerable stretch of their lives making sure she always had the full picture going forward. The ridge is still there. The Apache families are still there, at least for now. The law office in Boston is presumably still bewildered. The dented tin is still on the shelf. And somewhere in a logbook that is now full and closed and sitting in a saddlebag in the northern country, there is a small star in the margin next to the entry from a January evening in 1890, when a woman in a dark blue wool dress looked sideways at a man in a pressed collar with the careful terror of someone making peace with trust.